Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into something fascinating. It's the hidden language that, well, some sources say governs maybe 60, even 70% of our interaction.
Yeah, it's huge.
But it stays largely invisible, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about the rules, the channels, and importantly, the ethics of nonverbal communication.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today, like always, is pretty straightforward. We've got this stack of sources, everything from cultural studies, psychological research, and we're boiling it down so you can get quickly up to speed on this, essential but often overlooked language.
It really is critical because, think about it. When most people talk communication, they're just focused on the words, right? The verbal message.
Right, like you actually say.
Exactly. But the reality, as the research shows, is that the bulk of the message, the real weight of it, is often delivered silently. Our sources, they define nonverbal communication pretty broadly. It's all forms of communication that happen without words.
Wow, all forms. So that covers everything.
Pretty much everything. How we stand, how close we get to people, even how we use time, blinking speed even. It's incredibly broad.
Okay, right. And that scope, the sheer size of it, that must be why it's so easy to miss these signals. We're talking about, like you said, everything from a deliberate thumbs up
Yeah, an intentional gesture.
to how long you pause before answering a question. And what really jumped out at me from the material is this key distinction that kind of defines its power, really. Nonverbal stuff includes both the intentional signals like, waving someone over,
Deliberate, conscious.
and the really revealing unintentional signals, the stuff we don't even know we're doing, like fidgeting or swallowing nervously, maybe a tiny shift in posture.
Yeah.
You're broadcasting it, but you're not aware of it.
And that unintentional part, that's precisely why these nonverbal cues often carry so much more weight. They feel more authentic.
Because they're unfiltered.
Exactly. They bypass conscious thought. They're much harder to fake convincingly. And so people listening, or rather watching, tend to see them as more truthful. Especially, and this is key, when those nonverbal signals contradict what's being said verbally.
Ah, the mismatch.
That conflict, that what researchers sometimes call leakage, that's where you get massive insight. It's often the body telling a different story than the mouth.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we really want to get a handle on this silent language, we can't just lump it all together. Nonverbal communication, it seems, is actually a collection of distinct channels, or codes, as the sources often call them.
That's the way to think about it. Knowing these different codes, these channels, is really the key to understanding what you're seeing much faster. It gives you a framework.
Exactly. So we've synthesized our material, and it basically breaks down into 9 main channels. Each one is almost like a separate field of study, in a way. And if you want to spot that conflict we mentioned, or maybe enhance your own communication, your own presence, you really need to understand where to look. These are the categories. Okay, 9 channels. Where should we start? Maybe the most obvious one. How we use our bodies.
Let's start there. That's kinesics, basically. The body in motion. This covers all your body movements, your gestures, your posture overall. It's not just about, big dramatic movements. It's often about the really subtle signals. Tension versus relaxation.
Like how someone carries themselves.
Precisely. Think about the difference, for instance, between someone who adopts an expansive posture. They take up space, shoulders are back, maybe hands on hips. That often signals confidence, maybe high status, right?
Yeah, see that. The power pose idea.
Right. Versus someone adopting a protective posture. Shoulders hunched, arms maybe crossed tightly across the chest. The whole body seems to kind of contract. That tends to signal defensiveness or anxiety or maybe low status. Big difference in the message.
And within kinesics, it's not just posture, it's gestures too. But we need to differentiate there, don't we? Because some gestures seem to help us talk, and others are just, nervous habits.
That's a really key distinction within kinesics. You've got what are called illustrators. These are the gestures that literally illustrate your words. Like if you're describing something huge, you might move your hands far apart. They map onto the speech.
Okay, makes sense. They help the explanation.
Then you have adapters. These are self-touching behaviors, often totally subconscious. They tend to pop up under stress. Things like picking at your fingernails, running a hand through your hair constantly, rubbing the back of your neck.
Ah, the fidgeting stuff.
Exactly. And these adapters, they're often the very first visible signs of stress leakage, the body trying to self-soothe, basically.
Okay. So kinesics is the big picture of the body. If we zoom in, what's the most concentrated area for signals? Got to be the face, right? And the eyes.
Absolutely. That brings us to facial expressions and gaze. The human face is incredibly complex, capable of conveying just enormous amounts of nuance. Now, while some basic expressions think happiness, sadness, fear, anger seem to be pretty universal across
The
cultures.
classic ones.
Right. But our sources really emphasize the importance of something called microexpressions. Have you heard of these?
Vaguely. They're super fast, aren't they?
Incredibly fast. They're these rapid, involuntary flashes of genuine emotion, sometimes lasting as little as like 1/25th of a second. It happens before the person can consciously put on their social mask.
So it's the real feeling leaking out before they can stop it.
That's the idea. So if someone's verbally saying, oh, thank you so much for this gift, I love it, but you see this incredibly brief flash of, say, contempt or disgust cross their face, that microexpression, however fleeting, is probably the truer signal.
Wow. Hard to catch, though, I imagine.
Very hard. Takes practice. But then there are the eyes, gaze, or eye contact. It's intensely powerful. It often dictates the whole rhythm of a conversation.
How so? What does it signal?
Well, in most Western cultures, for example, maintaining moderate, steady eye contact generally signals sincerity, confidence, engagement. Too much can feel aggressive or intimidating. Too little can suggest disinterest or shiftiness, or sometimes deference.
And it regulates the conversation flow.
Huge role there. Think about turn taking. When you're speaking, you typically maintain slightly less eye contact than when you're actively listening. Then, as you're about to finish your thought, your gaze might naturally trail off for a second or shift towards the listener more directly. That's often the cue.
Ah, signaling your turn.
Exactly. It tells the other person the floor is about to be theirs. Conversely, if someone wants to interrupt, they might increase their eye contact quite suddenly. It's all part of this complex dance.
Okay, this next one, this is where it gets really interesting for me. It's the part of communication that's sound, but it's not the actual words. I'm talking about paralanguage.
Yes, the voice, but crucially not the words themselves. Paralanguage covers all those vocal qualities, your tone of voice, your pitch high versus low, your speaking speed, the volume.
So how you say it, not what you say.
Precisely. And think about the nuances just within that. For example, really rapid speech. What could that mean?
Excitement, nerves, maybe trying to rush through something.
Exactly. It could be enthusiasm or it could be anxiety. The interpretation depends heavily on the tone that accompanies the speed and the context, of course. On the flip side, slower, more measured speech, especially if it's combined with a slightly lower pitch, often projects authority, deliberation, control.
That makes sense. What about some of the more modern vocal trends people talk about? Things like vocal fry or that upward inflection, upspeak.
Oh, perfect examples of paralanguage impacting impression management. Vocal fry, that kind of low, creaky, gravelly sound, often at the end of sentences.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
Right. And fairly or unfairly, it can sometimes be perceived as indicating boredom or disinterest or even a lack of professionalism, even though for many people it might just be a physiological habit.
So it sends a signal, intended or not.
It absolutely sends a signal. And upspeak, where you raise the pitch at the end of a declarative statement, making it sound almost like a question.
Yeah, I finished the report.
Exactly like that. That can inadvertently signal uncertainty or deference, maybe like you're seeking approval rather than stating a fact. It can undermine perceived authority, regardless of how strong the actual words are.
Fascinating how much is packed into just the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't forget silence, can we? The pauses.
Oh, never underestimate the power of the pause within paralanguage. Silence communicates too. A pause that feels too long after a direct question might signal hesitation. Maybe that the person is formulating a deceptive answer, or perhaps they're just genuinely struggling to recall information or process the question.
But pauses can be used strategically too.
Absolutely. A brief, well-placed pause can really accent a point. It builds a little tension, makes the listener lean in, and emphasizes the importance of the words that follow. Silence, used intentionally, is an incredibly powerful regulatory tool in conversation. Punctuation for speech, almost.
Okay, so we've covered the body in motion, the face and eyes, the voice. What about how we interact with the space around us, our environment?
Right. That brings us to proxemics. This is the study of how we use space and how the distance we maintain between ourselves and others communicates relational status, comfort levels, and cultural norms.
Like personal space bubbles.
Essentially, yes. The sources often refer back to the work of anthropologist Edward T. Hall, who mapped out these distinct sort of invisible zones of personal territory. There's usually four main ones discussed.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have intimate distance. That's skin contact out to about maybe 18 inches. This is reserved for very private interactions, comforting, protecting intimate relationships. If a stranger violates this zone,
Yeah, feels really uncomfortable. Invasive.
extremely uncomfortable. Then there's personal distance, roughly 1.5 feet to about 4 feet. This is typically the distance for conversations with friends, family, close colleagues, comfortable interaction distance.
Okay.
Third is social distance. This is wider, maybe 4 feet to 12 feet. Think formal business transactions, interacting with acquaintances, maybe small group discussions. This is often the default distance in a professional office setting.
Right, keeps things a bit more formal.
And finally, public distance, which is 12 feet and beyond. This is for public speaking, addressing large groups, formal occasions where you need separation. The key takeaway here, though, is that the size and permeability of these zones are massively influenced by culture and context. What's normal personal distance in one culture might feel like intimate distance in another.
Huge potential for misunderstanding there. And closely related to space, maybe even more sensitive, is actual physical contact, right? Touch.
Definitely related and definitely sensitive. That's haptics, the study of touch as communication. Touch is fundamental. It's vital for infant development, for bonding, but how, when, and who we touch is incredibly culturally mediated.
So it varies a lot.
Massively. In a professional context in, say, North America, touch is usually quite restricted. It often falls into what's called the functional professional category, like a doctor examining a patient or a coach adjusting an athlete's stance. Purely task-oriented.
Or maybe a handshake.
Right, that fits into the social polite category. Ritualized greetings and departures. But if touch is perceived as moving into the friendship warmth or especially the love intimacy category in an inappropriate setting, like an office.
Yeah, that can cause immediate problems,
Yeah.
serious HR issues.
Exactly. Relational damage can happen instantly. And another interesting aspect of haptics is how it relates to status. Often the person with the higher perceived status is more likely, or feels more permitted, to initiate touch, like placing a hand on a subordinate's shoulder. It can subtly reinforce hierarchy.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got kinesics, face gaze, paralanguage, proxemics, haptics. The sources also highlight three other elements, ones that are constantly sending signals even when we're not moving or speaking. Let's start with maybe the most visible, how we present ourselves. Our clothes, grooming.
Right. Appearance, dress, adornment. This speaks volumes often before we even open our mouths. It covers clothing choices, accessories, hairstyles, tattoos, piercings, makeup, overall grooming. People make incredibly fast and often quite profound judgments based on these visual cues.
Judgments about what?
About almost anything, really. Identity, social status, economic level, group affiliation, personality traits like creativity or conformity, even things like trustworthiness or competence. Think about wearing a sharp business suit versus ripped jeans and a band t-shirt, or displaying expensive power jewelry versus simple, minimal adornment, or a uniform.
A uniform broadcast function and affiliation immediately.
Instantly. It's all a form of conscious or sometimes unconscious impression management, delivered through visual artifacts we choose to wear or display on our bodies.
Okay, then there's another invisible layer of communication, how we handle time itself.
That would be chronemics, the study of time as a communicative tool. And it's incredibly revealing about cultural values and personal priorities. Are you consistently punctual, often delayed? How long do you make someone wait for you? How much time do you dedicate to a specific task or person versus another?
Seems straightforward, but I guess it's not.
Not globally, no. This is where the sources bring in a really important cultural distinction. They talk about monochronic time or M-time cultures. Here, time is seen as linear, tangible, like a commodity. It can be saved, spent, wasted. Schedules are important. Punctuality is a sign of respect and efficiency. Think Northern Europe, North America generally.
Okay, one thing at a time, stick to the schedule.
Pretty much. Then you have polychromic time or P-time cultures. In these cultures, time is perceived as more fluid, more flexible. Multiple things might happen at once. Schedules are less rigid, and priorities often shift based on relationships and circumstances rather than a strict clock. Interruptions are more common and often expected. Think Latin America, the Middle East, parts of Africa, and Southern Europe.
And if these two clash?
Oh, it's a huge source of international business friction and misunderstanding. The M-time person sees the P-time person as disrespectful and disorganized for being late or juggling tasks. The P-time person might see the M-time person as rigid, impersonal, and obsessed with the clock over people. The nonverbal message sent by your use of time is completely different.
Wow. Okay. And the last channel in this group of 9. The things around us.
Artifacts. These are the objects in our environment, the possessions we choose to surround ourselves with, that project aspects of our identity or status. Think about someone's workspace, for example.
Right. A huge, imposing mahogany desk versus a minimalist standing desk.
Exactly. One signals traditional authority, maybe power. The other might signal modernity, health consciousness, maybe collaboration. What about the things on the desk? Framed family photos suggesting warmth, approachability, work-life balance. Or is it meticulously organized, suggesting detail orientation and control? Or maybe creatively chaotic?
Suggesting creativity, perhaps, or just messiness.
Oh, that's the ambiguity again, right. But the artifacts themselves send signals. The car you drive, the brand of coffee mug you carry, the art you hang on your walls, the books on your shelf, all these objects are nonverbal communicators, constantly shaping the impression others form of you, consciously or not.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive tour of the 9 channels: kinesics, face gaze, paralanguage, proxemics, haptics, appearance, chronemics, and artifacts. But you said these don't just operate in isolation, right? They
Yeah.
follow certain rules or principle.
Exactly. Now we move from the what the channels to the how. How does this system actually function? What are its fundamental characteristics? And understanding these rules is crucial because they highlight why interpretation is so damn tricky.
Okay, rule number 1.
The first, and maybe the most critical principle, is that nonverbal communication is often inherently ambiguous.
Meaning, a single gesture doesn't just mean one thing.
Precisely. A specific nonverbal cue, a smile, a crossed arm, avoiding eye contact rarely has one single concrete universal meaning. Its significance depends massively on the context.
Context like what?
Social context, who are the people involved, what's their relationship, environmental context, where is this happening? Is it hot, cold, noisy, public, private, and crucially, cultural context. What are the norms for this behavior in this particular culture?
Can you give an example of that ambiguity?
Sure. Take the simple act of avoiding eye contact. In a Western legal setting, like testifying in court, avoiding the questioner's gaze might be interpreted as implying deceit, guilt, or discomfort.
Yeah, looks suspicious.
But take that same behavior, avoiding direct eye contact, and put it in the context of a subordinate speaking to a high-status superior in many traditional East Asian cultures. There, avoiding direct eye contact is often a mandatory sign of respect and deference. Making strong eye contact might be seen as challenging or disrespectful.
Wow. Exact opposite interpretation.
Completely opposite. So without understanding the surrounding variables, the relationship, the setting, the cultural rules, you're not really interpreting the signal. You're just projecting your own cultural assumptions onto it. You're basically guessing.
Okay, so ambiguity and context dependence are huge. What's another key principle?
Another fundamental characteristic, and one that really distinguishes it from verbal language, is that nonverbal communication is continuous. It's always on.
Unlike speaking, which we can choose to start or stop.
Exactly. You can decide not to speak. You can be silent verbally, but you cannot not communicate nonverbally. Even if you try to freeze completely still, that very lack of movement, that tension, communicates something, maybe fear, maybe resistance, maybe intense concentration. You're always broadcasting signals, whether you intend to or not.
And because a lot of it is unconscious.
That's the kicker. Because so much of it is mediated by the subconscious mind, the limbic system reacting to stimuli, it's virtually impossible to control fully, all the time. Those unintentional signals, that leakage we talked about, they're streaming out constantly, even when we think we're presenting a composed front.
The subconscious just keeps leaking information.
Yeah, okay.
And this continuous stream of nonverbal signals, how does it interact with the actual words we're saying? Our sources must categorize that relationship.
They do. The interaction between the verbal and nonverbal streams typically falls into one of four modes, and these modes really determine how the overall message is perceived and interpreted by the listener. They can be reinforcing, contradicting, replacing, or accenting the verbal message.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's really focus on the psychological impact, especially of the first two. Reinforcing that sounds straightforward. The nonverbals match the verbals.
Yes, this is when your nonverbal signals support and strengthen your words. If you say, I am absolutely determined to meet this deadline, and your tone of voice is firm and low, paralanguage, your posture is upright and maybe leaning slightly forward, kinesics, and your gaze is steady, gaze.
Then the message is really clear, unified.
Exactly. The message is powerfully unified. The nonverbal cues amplify the verbal statement, making it more convincing, more impactful. This is alignment.
Okay, but the second one, contradicting. This sounds like where the real drama, the real insight happens.
Oh, absolutely. Contradiction is fundamental, particularly when it comes to things like detecting deception or discomfort. This is the classic scenario. Someone says, oh, yes, I'm perfectly happy to take on this extra project, but their facial expression shows a very tight, forced smile. Not a genuine Duchenne smile involving the eyes while their hands are maybe wringing together or repeatedly touching their face. Adapters.
So the words say yes, but the body screams no.
Pretty much. And when this kind of conflict occurs, when the verbal and nonverbal channels send opposing messages, which one does the listener tend to believe?
I'm guessing the nonverbal, the body language.
Almost always. The listener's brain, perhaps due to evolutionary reasons, trusting actions over words, assigns far greater weight to the nonverbal signal. It's perceived as the less controlled, more authentic, truer stream of information. The leakage is seen as revealing the real feeling.
So rule of thumb, if verbal contradicts nonverbal, the nonverbal message usually wins the interpretation battle. Huge implications for trust and credibility.
Massive. Okay, what about the third mode? Replacing. Replacing is simply using a nonverbal cue instead of a verbal word or phrase. It's about substitution and efficiency. We do this constantly.
Like shrugging your shoulders instead of saying, I don't know.
Perfect example. Or shaking your head for no, nodding for yes, giving a thumbs up for okay or good job. These nonverbal emblems replace words entirely, especially when verbal communication isn't needed or possible. It speaks to the efficiency of the nonverbal code sometimes.
Quick and easy. And the last one, accenting.
Accenting is about using nonverbal cues to emphasize or punctuate specific parts of your verbal message, to add stress or importance.
Like hitting the table for emphasis.
That's one way, yes. Using kinesics for emphasis, or if you verbally state a specific number, we need exactly 3 volunteers for this, and you simultaneously hold up 3 fingers, kinesics, you're accenting, underscoring the importance of that particular data point.
Or like the pauses we talked about in paralanguage.
Exactly. Using a strategic pause right before delivering a key phrase to build anticipation and add weight. Accenting helps direct the listener's attention to what you consider most important in your verbal message.
Okay, those 4 modes, reinforcing, contradicting, replacing, accenting, make a lot of sense in how verbals and nonverbals interact. But we absolutely have to come back to culture here, don't we? Because even if we master spotting these interactions, if we're doing it across cultures, the whole rulebook can change.
It absolutely can, and often does. This brings us to another core principle. Nonverbal signals are heavily, deeply culturally bound. What's a perfectly normal, acceptable, even polite signal in one cultural context might be meaningless, confusing, or even deeply offensive in another.
And we often forget just how much varies, right? It's not just obvious gestures like the OK sign.
Not at all. We often forget that these profound cultural differences apply just as strongly, maybe even more strongly, to those seemingly fundamental concepts like proxemics, how close we stand, and chronemics, how we treat time.
Right, the M time versus P time thing.
Exactly. In a strongly M-time culture like Germany or Switzerland, being 10 minutes late for a business meeting without a very good pre-communicated reason can be seen as a serious sign of disrespect, incompetence, or lack of seriousness. It sends a very negative nonverbal message about your reliability.
Okay.
But in a strong P-time culture, say in parts of Latin America, Arriving 10 or 15 minutes after the scheduled time might be perfectly normal, even expected. And interrupting that meeting because a family member calls with an urgent issue might be seen as appropriately prioritizing important relationships over the rigid demands of the clock.
So the definition of what constitutes respectful or disrespectful nonverbal behavior is entirely dictated by the cultural lens.
Completely. And failure to understand this is probably the single biggest cause of cross-cultural communication breakdown, assuming universality or it doesn't exist.
Okay. So these continuous, ambiguous, culturally bound signals, ultimately, they serve some really big core functions in our social lives, don't they? They seem to define who we are, how we relate, what we feel, often silently.
Yes, they are absolutely fundamental to our social existence. Think about their core functions. They play a massive role in impression formation. Those critical first few seconds when we meet someone new, we're sizing them up based almost entirely on nonverbal cues. Appearance, posture, energy level.
Making snap judgments.
We do.
Yeah.
They continuously signal and help maintain social status and power dynamics. Who gets more space? Who initiates touch? Who interrupts whom? Who holds eye contact longer? These nonverbal exchanges constantly negotiate and reinforce the hierarchy without a word being spoken.
And maybe the most basic function, showing how we feel.
Absolutely. Perhaps the most fundamental function is expressing raw, immediate emotion. Often, our nonverbal reactions, a gasp of surprise, a flush of embarrassment, tears of sadness, a widening of the eyes in fear happen before our conscious mind has even fully processed or labeled the feeling. They are the direct readout of our internal state.
Okay, so we've laid out the theory, the channels, the rules. Now let's really focus on the practical outcomes, the so what. Why does becoming fluent in this silent language actually matter day to day? And it seems like it matters hugely because these nonverbal cues are constantly shaping our social dynamics, starting right with emotional expression and how authentic we seem.
That's right. The primary, maybe most immediate function of nonverbal communication is emotional expression. As we just touched on, our facial expressions, our tone of voice, paralanguage, they're often the very first signals we send out about our internal state. When an emotion is genuine, especially a strong one like joy or grief, the nonverbal display is usually immediate and congruent.
Congruent meaning the signals match the feeling.
Yes, and the research on the Duchenne smile, that's the genuine felt smile that involves not just pulling the lip corners up, but also engages the orbicularis oculi muscles around the eyes, creating crow's feet.
Smile reaching the eyes.
Exactly. That research is a perfect illustration. If you see someone giving a mouth-only smile, a polite or social smile, but their eyes remain neutral or look dead, that nonverbal signal, the lack of eye muscle engagement, instantly suggests to the observer that the positive emotion might be performed, forced, or insincere, even if the words are, "I'm so happy."
And that perceived authenticity, or the lack of it, directly impacts how we manage the flow of conversation, right? How we regulate interactions.
Absolutely. Nonverbal cues are essentially the invisible traffic signals of dialogue. They are absolutely essential for regulating interaction. Think about the complex, mostly unconscious mechanisms of turn-taking in a conversation.
How do nonverbals manage that?
Well, when a speaker is getting ready to yield the floor, they often employ a cluster of signals. They might shift their gaze away from the listener momentarily, then back. They might slow down the rate of speech, paralanguage, their pitch might fall, they might relax their posture slightly, kinesics, maybe gesturing less. These cues signal, "I'm winding down."
Okay, opening the door for the other person.
Precisely. Conversely, a listener who wants to take a turn or perhaps interrupt will also signal their intent nonverbally. They might take a quick audible intake of breath, they might increase their eye contact intensity, they might shift their body forward slightly, maybe open their mouth as if to speak. They might use short vocalizations like uh-huh or yeah, but more frequently.
That's a constant negotiation using these cues.
It is. And it governs the smooth flow of conversation, mostly without us even having to think about it consciously. When these signals are missed or misinterpreted, conversations become awkward with lots of interruptions or uncomfortable silences.
Okay, and then there are those situations where we are thinking about it consciously. High-stakes moments like job interviews, negotiations, public speaking. That's where impression management comes in.
Right. Impression management is the sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious process of orchestrating our nonverbal signals to try and control how other people perceive us. We're actively trying to create a specific desired impression.
So it's strategic self-presentation.
Essentially, yes. We use kinesics, maybe adopting that power pose before a big presentation to feel and project confidence. We manage our appearance choosing clothes that signal professionalism, authority, or maybe creativity, depending on the goal. We carefully control our paralanguage, perhaps lowering our vocal pitch slightly and speaking at a measured pace to convey gravitas and control during a negotiation.
It's not just about showing competence then. It's about projecting a whole persona.
Exactly. It's about projecting the desired image, whether that's warmth, authority, trustworthiness, approachability, competence, whatever image we believe will help us achieve our social or professional objective in that specific interaction. We're curating our nonverbal broadcast.
And this ability to read signals, both our own and others, feeds directly into one of the most talked about, maybe most sought after functions of nonverbal awareness: deception detection. Can we really tell if someone's lying just from their body language?
Well, let's be careful here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the realistic goal of noticing nonverbal cues isn't really to definitively label someone a liar. That's very difficult and prone to error. The more practical goal is to notice signs of conflict, discomfort, or cognitive load.
What do you mean by cognitive load?
Lying, especially about something important, is often more mentally taxing than telling the truth. You have to invent a story, keep it consistent, monitor the listener's reactions, suppress the truth, and manage your own anxiety about getting caught. This increased cognitive effort and the associated stress often manifest as nonverbal leakage.
So what kind of leakage are we looking for?
We're looking for mismatches between the verbal and nonverbal channels, as we discussed. A strong verbal denial, I did not do that, delivered with a sudden increase in vocal pitch, or maybe a fleeting micro-expression of fear or guilt. We might look for an increase in those self-soothing adapters, more fidgeting, face-touching, hair twirling.
Anything else?
Maybe changes in blinking rate, either much faster or sometimes unnaturally slow. Perhaps subtle signs of tension in the body posture, like rigid shoulders or tightly pressed lips. And interestingly, some research suggests looking at the feet.
The feet? Really?
Yeah, surprisingly, the feet are often one of the least consciously controlled parts of the body. Their orientation, like pointing towards the nearest exit, even while the torso is facing the speaker, can sometimes signal an unconscious desire to escape the situation. Again, none of these are proof of lying on their own, but a cluster of these deviations from baseline behavior might indicate deception or, at the very least, significant discomfort with the topic.
Okay, so it's about noticing inconsistencies in stress signals, not just calling someone a liar. And finally, beyond these specific moments, these nonverbal signals are constantly working in the background, reinforcing the relationships we already have, right? Dictating closeness, distance, power.
Absolutely. Nonverbal signals continuously shape and maintain existing relationships and status hierarchies. Think about relational closeness. Two people in an intimate relationship will naturally tolerate, even seek out, very close proximity, intimate distance and proxemics, and frequent affectionate touch haptics.
Whereas business rivals.
Business rivals or mere acquaintances will typically maintain a much greater distance, social distance, and limit physical contact to perhaps a brief, formal handshake, if anything. The nonverbals clearly signal the nature and temperature of the relationship.
And power dynamics, too.
Constantly reinforced nonverbally. Who tends to have the more relaxed posture? Who takes up more space? Who initiates touch? Who interrupts more often or holds the floor longer? Paralanguage. Whose gaze tends to hold longer in a stare down. Often these subtle nonverbal exchanges continuously signal and reinforce who has higher status or more power in the interaction, often without anyone needing to explicitly state their title or position. It maintains the social structure silently.
All right, so we've got the channels, we understand the rules, we see the functions. But the real challenge, the really deep dive part of this, is learning how to interpret these signals accurately. How do we do that without jumping to potentially dangerous or wrong conclusions? Our sources seem to scream one thing above all. Interpretation is basically worthless without considering context.
Context is absolutely the foundation. You
Yeah.
cannot interpret a nonverbal cue in a vacuum. We have to account for the social context. Who are these people to each other? What's their history? The environmental context, what's going on around them? Is it hot, cold, noisy, crowded, stressful? And as we keep stressing, the cultural context. What are the norms for this group?
Can you give a concrete example of how context completely changes the meaning?
Sure. Imagine you see a person sitting alone in an airport departure lounge. They're hugging themselves tightly, arms wrapped around their torso, and maybe rocking back and forth very slightly.
Okay, what might that mean?
Well, if the environmental context is that it's a warm, quiet, comfortable lounge, your interpretation might lean towards high stress, anxiety, maybe personal distress, or fear of flying. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, seems plausible.
But now, change the environmental context. Imagine that same person, same posture, same rocking motion, but they're sitting outside the airport terminal in the middle of a freezing blizzard waiting for a ride. Now what's the interpretation?
Uh-huh. They're just trying to stay warm.
Exactly. The behavior is identical, but the context transforms the meaning entirely. You cannot interpret the rocking and self-hugging as anxiety unless you first rule out the much simpler explanation provided by the environmental context, they're cold. Context always comes first.
Okay, context is king. Now, another key insight from our material seems to be the danger of focusing too much on just one isolated signal, like seeing someone scratch their nose and immediately thinking they're lying. We need to look for patterns, right? The cluster approach.
Yes, that's the crucial rule of looking for clusters versus single cues. Relying on a single nonverbal cue is incredibly risky and often leads to misinterpretation. That person briefly touching their nose. That single cue in isolation could mean absolutely anything. They might have an itch, it might be allergies, it could be a nervous habit completely unrelated to deception, it might just be a random movement.
So one cue tells you almost nothing for sure.
Very little. But if that single nose touch cue is combined with, say, a sudden noticeable increase in vocal pitch, paralanguage, and maybe the person simultaneously tucks their hands away into their pockets or behind their back, kinesics, perhaps they start frequently glancing down towards the floor instead of maintaining eye contact, gaze.
Ah, now you have several things happening at once.
Exactly. Now you have a cluster of maybe 3 or 4 different signals across different channels, all potentially pointing in a similar direction, perhaps towards discomfort, nervousness, evasion, or lack of commitment to what they're saying. That cluster provides a much more robust, though still not definitive, basis for interpretation. Reliability comes from the convergence of multiple cues.
Okay, so look for clusters, not isolated signs. And even when we see a cluster of signals, they only really make sense when compared to how that specific individual normally behaves, right? This brings us to what seems like the most critical analytical skill of all, establishing a baseline behavior.
This is absolutely non-negotiable for any kind of accurate analysis. Before you can interpret any deviation as potentially significant, you must first have a sense of what is normal, nonverbal behavior for that specific person in a relatively normal, low-stress, candid situation.
How do you establish a baseline?
By observing them when they're relaxed. Talking about neutral topics, the weather, their weekend plans, hobbies, what's their typical posture? How much do they normally gesture? What's their usual rate of speech and pitch range? How much eye contact do they typically maintain? Some individuals, for instance, naturally speak very rapidly and use huge, expansive illustrative gestures all the time. That's just their style.
So for them, fast talking and big gestures isn't a sign of anxiety, it's just them.
Exactly. If they do that consistently, even when relaxed, then that's their baseline. It doesn't signify anything unusual for them.
Okay, so if that's the baseline, what defines a significant deviation?
A deviation becomes potentially meaningful when that person shifts noticeably and significantly away from their established normal pattern of behavior, especially when they're put under pressure, asked a difficult question, or discussing a sensitive topic.
So it's the change that matters.
Precisely. It's the change from baseline that is the most reliable indicator that something significant might be going on internally. So for that person who normally gestures widely and talks fast, if, when asked a pointed question, they suddenly clamp their arms rigidly to their sides, stop gesturing almost completely, and their speech becomes hesitant. That shift, that marked deviation from their normal baseline, is what flags potential stress, discomfort, or maybe deception. It's the contrast, not the behavior itself in isolation.
That makes so much sense. Establish normal, then look for the changes under pressure. But this does raise a really important question. Even with context, clusters, and baseline, where do we hit the limits? Nonverbal communication, for all its power, clearly isn't a perfect mind-reading tool. What are the pitfalls?
Oh, there are major limits and pitfalls we absolutely must acknowledge to interpret responsibly. Probably the highest risk is the misinterpretation fallacy, often driven by confirmation bias or just seeing patterns where none exist.
Like reading too much into something innocent.
Exactly. People often engage in a kind of nonverbal pareidolia, like seeing faces in clouds. They see a random gesture or posture and assign deep, often negative, meaning to it based on their own assumptions or pop psychology myths. That person crossing their arms might genuinely just be cold or comfortable, or maybe they just saw someone else do it. But if you immediately interpret it as defensive or closed off based on some simplistic rule,
You might react negatively and actually create defensiveness.
Precisely. You've created a self-fulfilling prophecy based on a potential misinterpretation of an ambiguous cue. That's incredibly common and damaging.
Okay, what else limits our ability to interpret accurately? What about people who know about this stuff and actively try to manipulate their signals?
That's another significant limit, the possibility of deliberate control or faking. While it's hard to control all nonverbal channels perfectly, especially under pressure, highly practiced individuals absolutely can manage some cues quite effectively. Think trained negotiators, experienced politicians, professional actors, maybe even skilled salespeople or people who have undergone specific therapies.
So they can consciously override their leakage.
To some extent, yes. They might consciously maintain steady eye contact, adopt an open and relaxed posture, use controlled illustrators, and modulate their voice to project calmness or sincerity, even when they're feeling something else entirely. They can sometimes create a convincing nonverbal performance that aligns perfectly with a deceptive verbal message. Leakage probably still occurs somewhere, maybe in microexpressions, maybe in adapters they're less aware of, but it becomes much, much harder to spot without very close observation and a solid baseline.
So we can be fooled by skilled actors. What about when the signals themselves seem to be fighting each other? Internal conflict.
That's another confusing factor. Nonverbal signals can, and often do, conflict with each other. The message across different channels isn't unified. For example, someone might verbally say, "Yes, I'm really excited about leading this new project," and their vocal tone might indeed sound enthusiastic, paralanguage reinforcing.
Yeah, okay, sounds good so far.
But at the same time, you might notice their facial expression looks tense. Maybe their lips are pressed tightly together, their brow is furrowed slightly, facial expression, contradicting, and they're engaging in high-frequency self-adapters like rubbing their hands together or fidgeting with a pen, kinesics, contradicting.
So the voice is excited, but the face and hands say stressed.
Exactly. The overall nonverbal message is fractured, inconsistent. It suggests an internal conflict. Maybe they are genuinely excited about the opportunity, hence the voice, but they're also feeling deep anxiety or pressure about the responsibility or their ability to succeed, hence the face and hands. The conflicting signals reveal that inner turmoil.
Which requires even more nuanced interpretation. And we have to circle back one more time, I think, to maybe the biggest external failure point in interpretation.
It always comes back to this, doesn't it? Cultural miscommunication remains arguably the single greatest limitation and source of error. Assuming that nonverbal signals are universal, or interpreting signals from someone from culture B using the rulebook from culture A is just a recipe for failure.
Because the meaning itself changes.
The meaning itself changes. If you try to apply a standard Western baseline interpretation about appropriate eye contact duration, personal space bubbles, the meaning of silence, the significance of punctuality, or even the acceptability of expressing certain emotions openly to someone from a radically different cultural background, your analysis is likely to be immediately and profoundly flawed. The failure point isn't necessarily in reading the signal itself, but in the culturally inappropriate assumption you make about what that signal means.
Okay, we've gone deep into the anatomy, the rules, the functions, and the critical need for careful interpretation context clusters, baseline, acknowledging limits. Now let's really bring this home. Let's make it actionable. This knowledge isn't just academic, right? It has massive practical utility starting in the professional world, especially in high-stakes situations.
Oh, absolutely. Understanding and consciously managing nonverbal signals can dramatically improve performance across a huge range of professional settings. Think about sales and negotiation, for instance.
How does it help there?
By closely observing your counterpart's nonverbal cues, are they leaning in, showing interest, proxemics? Are their arms open or crossed, kinesics? Is their smile genuine, facial expression? Are they mirroring your posture slightly, suggesting rapport? Noticing these subtle shifts allows you to gauge their real-time reactions, interest, skepticism, stress, agreement, and adjust your pitch, your arguments, your concessions accordingly. It's like getting real-time feedback beyond their words.
And for leaders? Or in interviews?
For leaders, developing a strong, congruent, nonverbal presence is crucial. Delivering instructions or feedback with a steady vocal tone, confident posture, and appropriate eye contact, paralanguage, kinesics, gaze, project stability, credibility, and control, especially during times of change or crisis, it builds trust. In job interviews, your nonverbal signals, a firm handshake, good posture, controlled adapters, engaged listening cues often determine the outcome as much as, if not more than, your actual qualifications. They signal confidence and competence before you even dive deep into your resume.
Makes sense. Yeah. And this knowledge isn't just for the corner office or the boardroom, is it? It must dramatically improve our personal relationships, too.
Absolutely. Moving beyond the professional realm, honing your ability to read nonverbal cues can significantly enhance empathy and understanding in your personal life with partners, children, parents, friends.
How so? Give me an example.
Okay, imagine a teenager who comes home from school, slams their bag down, and when you ask how their day was, they mutter, "Fine," and try to stomp off to their room. Verbally, they're shutting down the conversation, maybe being defensive.
Yeah, typical teenager response sometimes.
Right. But if you notice their nonverbal cues, maybe their face looked flushed, their fists were clenched slightly, their breathing seemed a bit rapid. Facial expression kinesics, physiological signs related to paralanguage. Those signals might suggest underlying distress, anger, or frustration, not just dismissiveness.
So you react to the feeling, not just the word fine.
Exactly. Instead of reacting to the defensive verbal brush off, "Don't stomp off," you might choose to respond with empathy to the nonverbal signals of distress. "Wow, looks like you had a really rough day. Want to talk about it later?" That shift, responding to the unspoken feeling rather than the spoken words, can transform the interaction from potential confrontation into an opportunity for connection and support. It builds relational trust.
That's powerful. And it makes sense why this is seen as so vital in certain specialized fields where reading unspoken cues is literally part of the job.
Definitely. Our sources point to numerous fields where nonverbal literacy is essential. Think about media training for politicians or executives. They have to meticulously control every nonverbal signal because they know their visual delivery on camera often carries more weight than their carefully crafted verbal message. A shifty eye or a nervous tic can undermine everything.
What other fields?
Therapy and counseling, obviously. Therapists rely heavily on observing a client's posture, gestures, facial expressions, vocal tone, shifts in gaze, even how they use touch or space in the room. These nonverbals often convey crucial information about emotions, past traumas, or internal conflicts that the client may not be ready or even able to articulate verbally yet. It's a primary channel for understanding.
Makes sense. Law enforcement, too, I imagine.
Yes, law enforcement and security rely heavily on immediate, rapid reading of nonverbal cues, particularly kinesics, body language, movements, hand positions to assess potential threat levels, detect concealed weapons, or gauge intent during critical, high-stress encounters. It's about situational awareness and predicting behavior based on nonverbal patterns. Also, teaching, customer service, healthcare, anywhere human interaction is key.
But amidst all this focus on reading others, perhaps the most immediate and controllable application is turning that lens inward, right? Managing ourselves.
That's arguably the most powerful application, improving self-awareness. So many of us are largely oblivious to the nonverbal signals we're constantly sending out. We might think we look calm and confident during presentation, but we're unknowingly bouncing a leg, speaking too quickly, or avoiding eye contact. Our nonverbal leakage might be completely undermining our intended message.
So how do we become more self-aware?
A really effective technique, though sometimes uncomfortable, is to videotape yourself. Record yourself during a practice presentation, a simulated meeting, even just talking about a topic you feel strongly about. Then watch it back with the sound off initially. Just focus on your kinesics, your facial expressions, your gaze patterns. Then watch it with sound, paying attention to your paralanguage tone, pitch, speed, pauses.
What does that do?
It allows you to objectively observe your own nonverbal habits, your common adapters, your posture shifts when under pressure, your vocal patterns. By becoming aware of them, you can start to consciously manage them, ensuring that your nonverbal signals align seamlessly and authentically with your verbal messages and your actual intentions. Reducing that internal contradiction we talked about makes you appear more credible and congruent.
Alignment is key. Okay, we absolutely have to conclude this deep dive by facing the ethical dimension head on. Once you gain this knowledge, this heightened ability to potentially read discomfort, stress, maybe even deception in others, a certain responsibility comes with that, doesn't it?
Oh, there's an immense ethical consideration here that we absolutely must grapple with constantly. It's perhaps the most important takeaway. The big ethical trap is using this analytical framework as a tool for psychological surveillance, judgment, or even manipulation. Making sweeping, definitive assumptions about a person's character, intentions, or integrity based solely on a collection of nonverbal cues. That's dangerous territory.
Why so dangerous? Because the signals are ambiguous.
Primarily, yes. Given the inherent ambiguity of most nonverbal communication, the massive influence of context and culture, and the fact that signals like anxiety, stress, shyness, or even intense concentration can look remarkably similar to the stereotypical cues associated with deception or insincerity, we have to be incredibly cautious. Using this knowledge to definitively label someone, he's lying, she's defensive, she's not interested, based on a few ambiguous signals, is not only potentially inaccurate, it's ethically questionable.
So how should we use this knowledge ethically?
The ethical application lies primarily in using it for understanding, for empathy, for building rapport, and critically, for improving our own communication, clarity, and congruence. Use it to become a better listener, noticing when someone seems uncomfortable and maybe adjusting your approach. Use it to check if your own nonverbal signals are aligned with your message. But resist the urge to play armchair psychologist or human lie detector. We are observing potential indicators, not reading minds. Remember, the body can lie too. Context is paramount, and empathy should guide interpretation. #Chag outro converter.
Well, this has certainly been an extensive, deep dive into the hidden language that shapes so much of our lives. We've really untacked a lot. We covered those 9 fundamental channels, everything from the silent power of proxemics, how we use space, and chronemics, how we treat time, right through to the potential leakage we see in kinesics, our body language, and those revealing adapters.
And we stressed those foundational rules, didn't we? That nonverbal communication is continuous, always on, that it's profoundly culturally bound, no universal dictionary exists, and that it's often deeply ambiguous, requiring careful attention to context.
Right, and critically, you emphasize the need for rigorous, responsible analysis, moving beyond just reacting to single, isolated cues, and instead focusing on clusters of signals across multiple channels. And perhaps most importantly, establishing an individual's personal baseline behavior before ever trying to interpret the significance of any deviation.
Exactly. That framework channels rules, context clusters, baseline allows you to move from simply noticing behavior, which anyone can do, to potentially understanding its significance within a specific interaction. It's about informed observation, not just casual watching.
So what does this all really mean for you, the listener? Well, it means you now have a much richer analytical framework, a way to observe and hopefully better understand the most fundamental, yet often least consciously discussed, form of human connection and communication. The words we choose. They're vital, of course, but they're often only half the story. The silent signals carry so much of the weight.
And since our nonverbal communication is so continuous, often unconscious, and incredibly difficult to fully control, we are, in effect, constantly broadcasting information about ourselves, our feelings, our intentions, our comfort levels, our internal state. Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you to consider.
Okay, let's hear it.
Given everything we've discussed, the continuous broadcast, the lack of full control, the ambiguity, the cultural differences, the potential for misinterpretation, the challenge for you is this. How much weight should you ethically place on the signals people apparently can't control? Especially when you know those very signals are often ambiguous and so easily misinterpreted, mistaking simple anxiety for deceit or cultural difference for disrespect. It's a really fine line we all walk when we start truly trying to listen, not just with our ears, but with our eyes as well.
That is definitely something to ponder as you navigate your next conversation, your next meeting, your next interaction. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.